Hello and welcome to European SharePoint Training Week, a week of live webinars, ebooks and blogs from the top SharePoint experts in the industry. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Fitzmaurice, who will be talking to you about forms and workflow, putting the right work in the right place. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC14. Mike is one of an impressive list of speakers for the European SharePoint Conference, which will take place in Barcelona, May 5 to 8, 2014. Go to www.sharepointeurope.com for more information on the 100 plus sessions that will take place. All of the speakers from European SharePoint Training Week will be there, along with the likes of Dan Holm, Jeremy Take, Christian Buckley and Rafał Lukowickia. After the webinar we will have questions. Type any questions you have for Mike in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Mike Fitzmaurice. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Declan. Nice to talk to you today.
Pleasure.
All right. Are you seeing my screen all right?
Yeah, that's fine, Mike.
Fantastic. All right. Hi, everyone. Let's see. Possibly the best thing to do is to just get right into it. Let me point out one or two quick things. If you'd like to get in touch with me after the presentation, you can do so on Twitter @MikeFitz, or you can send me traditional email at mikefitz@nintex.com. A quick thing about me, I'm the Vice President of Product Technology. Think of me as the Chief Technology Officer, if that helps, at Nintex. And prior to that, I spent 11 years at Microsoft, most of that time on the SharePoint team. In fact, I was around when SharePoint came to be. I was the very first technical evangelist for SharePoint, and a long time ago it was my job to knock on doors, imploring people to care about SharePoint for the very first time. It is fun to see what's happened since. But today, Declan was kind enough to ask me to spend a few minutes with you and give you a sense of what it is I'll be talking about at the European SharePoint Conference in Barcelona. So I'll be doing a couple of sessions, one of which is general purpose advice that's useful no matter what tools or technology you're using to do workflow. And this is one of several things I'll cover during my presentation, and I'll expand on it, of course. So please, still come to the session. But if you'd like a good piece of advice right here, right now, I want to spend a few minutes on it with you. And that piece of advice is, it's not always about forms. Look, I love forms. I work for a company that has a forms product. But I'm here to tell you that it's not always about forms. You need to think about forms. Well, let me get into this by illustrating an issue for you. The form is the user interface for a solution. The form is not the entire solution. You might be very, very, very tempted to use InfoPath or something custom developed in ASP.NET or even Nintex forms to do 100% of the work. There are some issues with that, though. The form is not the workflow. You can embed some process logic if you try to inside the form, but that process logic is going to wind up being unmanageable. Moreover, the form is not the data. InfoPath tends to blur that line because you could say that an InfoPath form is an XML document containing data, but the InfoPath form is also an XML specification about how to lay out that data. It's sort of an overloaded term at that point. But I would implore you to think of the form as the user interface. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. A lot of InfoPath forms, and I'm not picking on InfoPath, I'm just using it as a convenient example. The InfoPath form comes out, and you are meant to fill out a variety of fields depending on the circumstances. Once you go ahead and submit that form, a bunch of rules or embedded code or a bunch of other things kick in, and do what they have to do to react to what you just did to the form, and then the end result is the form is transformed into another shape or state or view or whatever, and it's meant to be dealt with in a different way by a different person. When they go ahead and do some work with it and wind up submitting it, still more code or rules or other things kick in and transform the form still further until someone else is meant to do something else. Now, you might ask yourself at this point, what's wrong with that? I'll tell you what. Form-only app problems. The first is that logic is hidden. You might have clever work being done inside of rules, but if you start having a lot of rules, they become very, very difficult to manage. What's more, they become very, very difficult to explain to someone else and very difficult to change. And eventually, and a number of InfoPath people have come to realize this, you'll be tempted to just go ahead and dump the rules and embed actual code inside of your form. It can get nasty very, very quickly. The logic is disconnected. In other words, what's going on in the form doesn't necessarily, it's not obvious because all of the logic you have to put in the form is very reactive to something happening in the user interface at any given time. And the security issues, if you need to access data that lives in an unusual place and requires privileged assets, well, you've placed all of the application logic in something that gets downloaded into the client. It's not a pretty sight. There are other ways to do this that are a lot more productive because effectively putting everything into the user interface gives you all of the complexity of a custom code-based solution without any actual code to put through formal code versioning and validation processes. What I'd encourage you to do is think about the entire app or the entire solution. And most apps are designed to have three fundamental components. The first one is the user interface, and this is absolutely where forms are meant to live. But independent of the user interface is process logic, and independent of that is accessing data. This is what's commonly known of as a three-tiered application. And a three-tier application, you could have multiple tiers, but classically it's these three that matter. And doing all three, putting process logic in the user interface, putting data access logic in the user interface is a recipe for confusion. There's a reason we separate these, not the least of which is if we decide the process is wrong, we don't have to change the user interface or rearrange the data. We can just fix this. If we need to migrate the data from a SharePoint list to an actual proper database, we can do so without manipulating the logic or the user interface. Everybody continues to win. And if for some reason we want another user interface to access the same process logic or the same data, we don't have to refactor the entire application. We can change things, we can add things, we can reuse things. There are a lot of good reasons to designing an app this way. Here's the way I would encourage you to do this. Make the workflow do more of the work. You can document workflows more easily. You can audit workflows more easily. You can, in fact, well, here, I'll show you an example of how this would work if you started allowing the workflow to do some of the work that was being done with too many rules. Here's your form, the initial state of it. You go ahead and you fill out the appropriate fields you've been asked to done, and you submit it. Well, what this does is submit the form to a workflow process. And the workflow process kicks in, reaches a step in the workflow whose job it is to make some changes to the form. I set it to a different default view or what have you, and then the form transforms. Someone fills it out. That causes some checking on the values that are being submitted to take place. The form or the workflow branches to another step. The step does some transformations to the form gets transformed, someone fills out the new bit, the workflow moves on and completes. If you only did this, this would be a radical improvement. A few macros can still be in the form. That's fine. What I would say here is put display logic or presentation logic. In other words, if you need to conceal or reveal some fields or something to that effect, something that is strictly about the immediate user interface. Nothing involving the business logic itself. Allow the form to be submitted, allow a workflow to run, and then allow the workflow to present a new form to the user, usually by emailing them a notice to it or binding it to a task or something to that effect. All right. This is an improvement over the previous technique, but we can actually do it one better. I'd actually suggest that you use one form per step. And here, allow me to explain why. SharePoint has several different places where you can have a form. You can have one form that submits something to a process, and this is likely an InfoPath form bound to a SharePoint list, or an Nintex form bound to a SharePoint list, or it could be an XML form that gets saved to a document library, which could be, for that matter, a structured Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, an InfoPath form, what have you. But allow structured data to go into SharePoint to allow a workflow to start. And if for some reason you want to have multiple processes available and choose the one you want, present a form at the beginning of the workflow to allow for some extra information. That way you've got information collected when the workflow starts, if you need it, and information embedded in the content that you're submitting to start the workflow. The workflow is made up out of a lot of tasks, and a lot of the time the task may be just a URL pointing to something that you're supposed to do. Again, if you've been thinking about a form-centric approach to the world, you're probably having people go back to the same form over again to make changes to it. What I'd suggest is that you push the work that the user has to do to the user in the form of the task, instead of making them go back to another form, find it, and fill out their part of it. Again, pictures can help in a scenario like this. And if you're wondering why I'm so fond of pictures, again, I don't want to bias this to this philosophy towards a particular product. I don't care which forms environment you're using. This advice applies to any of them. Here is a form, and this is the form that is initially filled out to submit a request. Let's say it's an expense report. And that is sent into SharePoint, and it starts a workflow. Well, the next step in the workflow is to send a task to another user. Maybe it's the primary approver, the user's manager, to find out whether or not it's acceptable to take this. Well, this form is a completely different form. In fact, notice that the fields on this form don't look at all like the fields on this form. They're not two views of the same form. They're two different forms. It allows for this form and this form to be nice and simple and not have a lot of embedded secret logic. It also allows you to make changes to one form in the process without having to affect the other forms. So this form is tied to a SharePoint task. All we need to do is display this information and collect one little piece of information, and when it's submitted, the workflow advances. The workflow advances, and in fact, it sends out another form to another person for maybe a second stage of approval, or something to that effect. You gather that information from an independent form from them, and once that is done, the workflow proceeds. In all likelihood, it writes information into the financial accounting system by the time the whole thing is finished. Now, the difference here is that a workflow process is still in charge, but that workflow process is issuing forms, smaller forms, simpler forms, specific to each step in the workflow, rather than still having one complex form in one place and having everybody come back to it after transforming it. There's another big advantage to this. I can keep this form lying around as long as I need it. If I modified the form to prepare it for the next user at the next step, Well, I can't go back and take a look at it in its previous state. But if I do what I'm doing here, I have a copy of the form as it was submitted. I have a copy of the task form, as long as I don't delete the task, that shows me exactly what happened at that stage. And I have another copy of this task form. I can audit this so much more easily, either for legal purposes or regulatory purposes or just for debugging purposes or process improvement purposes. I have all those options available to me. Workflows can route new data back to the original location if you want them to. If you want to think of the original submitted InfoPath form as the primary place where the data lives, in other words, an XML document is your data store, that's fine. Let the workflow gather the information for the completed task and put that data back in the original form. In actuality, my suspicion is all that data you're collecting from the tasks and from the original submission needs to go somewhere new, either a new entry in a SharePoint list or a proper database, or it's submitted by a web service or a custom API to a line of business system of some sort. And that's all right as well. If you gather the right data at the right time from the right person, the workflow can combine all of that and then send that to the correct data store, which could be in SharePoint, but doesn't have to be. By the way, it's not just about forms, it's also not just about spreadsheets either. I think I had mentioned earlier that if you're submitting a request into a SharePoint library of some sort, that could be a form, that could be a structured workflow document. I've run into scenarios, particularly with financial type people, where everything they do is a spreadsheet. And it's the same problem, but a different file type in the sense of, I once encountered, or one of our partners once encountered a scenario where all of the, 99% of the work for process logic was being done inside the spreadsheet with calculations and macros. In fact, the only thing they really wanted the workflow to do was route it around to different people to fill in different parts of the spreadsheet at different stages. And even who was supposed to do it was calculated in the spreadsheet. They simply wanted something to automate sending mails and monitoring how long it took them to complete their edits. There was nothing, and the problem with that is, of course, there was nothing stopping two people from modifying the spreadsheet at once. It started to get very, very messy. But they just wanted routing and tracking, reminding of collaborative editing. They could have made the spreadsheets simpler. They could have allowed the workflow to read information from them and write information to them, but they opted not to, and it made for a very, very messy application. And a lot of refactoring happened, and things got better. I'm just saying the problem can emerge in many places, but it's the same kind of problem. All right, that's the last bit I wanted to say about this particular topic. Again, I will talk about this topic and several others in terms of advice I can give to people building workflow solutions in Barcelona next year. Looking forward to doing that. And in fact, if you'd like to send me questions, I modify my best practices for workflows topic on a very regular basis. I deliver the session all the time. The content of the session changes every year. So by all means, I'd love to hear your questions. And Declan, I think I heard you come back online audio-wise. If there's
I'm back online.
Perhaps you ask and I answer?
That's no problem, Mike. So first question we have here, how can you audit the form, in brackets history entries, when the fields are connected to the underlying data source, like a SP list that is updated for each workflow step?
Okay. It's a little hard to do that. Auditing the forms are not easy to audit. In fact, the only types of forms that are relatively easy to audit are the ones that are pure XML documents that are saved in document libraries. And because forms don't normally, you don't normally think of checking out and checking in a form, you need to set that document library up to automatically create a version whenever it's updated. if you're going to have forms bound to tasks, which is clearly what I'm recommending, it's not about auditing the forms themselves, it's about auditing the process, which, if you look at normal SharePoint workflow has some auditing capabilities, Nintex workflow has some auditing capabilities, so do other products as well. Workflow is much easier to keep a running log of what happened. So again, I would say make the workflow the star of the show, make the forms an important part of that, the part that the user sees, but it's a whole lot easier to audit a workflow than to audit a form.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mike. I just have a general question here. Someone's asking about how migration works with Nintex workflow from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2013.
If you're going on-premise from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2013, workflow is actually a pretty painless thing. We migrate them to workflows under the classic model, in other words, for backward compatibility. But yeah, a 2010 workflow, once you've migrated the server to 2013, should continue to work. In fact, even a workflow that's in progress should continue to be in progress post-migration. There are guidelines about how to do this on Nintex's website.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. Seems you've got a very smart crowd here today. Oh, another question just came in. Is the workflow engine in SharePoint the same as BizTalk?
No, it is not. There's some common technology to them, but in other words, Windows Workflow Foundation is at the core of BizTalk. At least it is now. Windows Workflow Foundation is at the core of SharePoint workflow. In 2013, there are two workflow engines for SharePoint. There's the classic workflow host, which is actually embedded into SharePoint itself, and the new workflow manager is a separately running process, which is based on Windows Server App Fabric on-premise, or Windows Azure App Fabric online. That's the same technology BizTalk uses. So I guess it depends on which version of SharePoint and which part of SharePoint. But a lot of the BizTalk services that were classic parts of that solution, you'll find a lot of them have found their way into just essential operating system services inside of App Fabric.
Okay. We've just one last question here, Mike. What is your opinion of the new SharePoint 2013 workflows functionality, and do you think it competes closer now with Nintex functionality?
Let's see. I think the engine got a lot better, but in the process of the engine getting better, a lot of features were taken away. So automatic logging isn't there. It's up to your workflow to do the logging. The focus in SharePoint 2013 with newer style apps is to look at one site at a time instead of having something span everything. And the deployment and performance considerations are non-trivial. Spencer Harbour put together a nice set of guidelines on properly deploying Workflow Manager, and it's not the easiest task in the world. But look, I understand the question. There's looping now in the new Workflow Manager. There's the concept of stages. These are the sorts of things people looked at Nintex Workflow to provide in the past. Every time the engine improves, we improve along with it, and we get to do things with the extra time we gain that we weren't able to do before because we were spending so much time addressing platform problems. So if you look at what has been done in 2013, we're glad that there are stages there. We're glad that there's looping there. It means that we can provide a lot more integration with other products. It allows us to do more things like manipulating everything in a list, everything in a library, talking to the search engine, talking to BizTalk, talking to CRM, making tasks much more simple. If you look at the out-of-the-box features with the new workflow engine, the number of available activities went down. There's no concept of querying a list and getting back a set of results. Look, it's good that the engine's better, but it takes some work to get running correctly, and even when you do, you'll find that you're missing a lot of things. Nintex work, and you still don't have the ability to manage and audit and track everything going on. People will still, I think, find Nintex workflow attractive for those things. We'd be crazy not to welcome improvements to the platform and, in fact, take advantage of them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Mike, for a great presentation today. Just before we go, I'd like to ask a question to all the audience. Are you coming to Barcelona? For those of you that don't know, the European SharePoint Conference 2014 will take place from 5th to 8th of May 2014 in beautiful Barcelona. For more information about what you can expect at Europe's largest SharePoint conference, check out our website www.sharepointeurope.com. Currently we have a range of competitive pricing options with our great early booking offer. Get a 3-day delegate pass for only $9.95. We also have some fantastic group booking offers available. The bigger your group, the bigger the discount. Check out our pricing page for more information. That's all for today's webinar, and hopefully you can join us for more great webinars this week. Thank you. Goodbye.